Hey, welcome back to Healthy Living Resources. This month we'll be talking to Katie Schlagheckwith about the importance of play, so stay tuned. Hey, and welcome back to this month's episode of Healthy Living Resources. This month we are joined by Katie Schlagheck. She is here to discuss the importance of play with us. We're also joined by Amy Meehan. So Katie, before we kind of jump into the topic, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and why this topic is so important to you?
Sure. My name is Katie Schlagheckwith. I am the Family Consumer Sciences Educator at The Ohio State University Extension in Ottawa and Sandusky counties. My background is in human development, so I've also dabbled a lot in child development. This topic is important. My husband actually kind of got me on this topic. He's a speech language pathologist at a local community hospital, and he does a lot of work with young children. And so he says that part of his recommendations for parents is to actually play with their kids. And he says, I am dumbfounded when parents kind of look at me and like, I don't know how to play with my child. So I felt like it was very important to kind of bring some attention to the topic of play and how parents can play with their children to make it meaningful.
All right, that's great. So play. Probably looks like a lot of things, as you'll get into, but tell us a little bit about play and maybe get into why it's so important for kids in their development.
Yeah, so play can be kind of defined as the work of children. So a lot of times when children are playing, adults see it as just, having fun, but we call it work because all play that children do helps in their development. So it helps them learn about how different things function, how they work, cause and effects, how to take turns, and a lot of other things. So one definition of play, so play is the work of children. It consists of activities performed for self-amusement that have behavioral, social, psychomotor rewards. Child-directed, and the rewards come from the individual child, and it is enjoyable and spontaneous. So when we think about play, we might just think, of a child sitting down and playing with a toy or going outside playing soccer. But when we talk about that definition, almost anything a child does can be considered play. So oftentimes we tell our kids, go play. But even if they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing, can still be considered play. They're learning about cause and effect and maybe even consequences. So a couple of reasons why play is important. So I kind of touch on three things. So one is that play is really important for brain development in our cognitive processes. So children, especially in the first 3 years of life, the brains are developing rapidly. So making a lot of neuron connections, they're expanding at a great rate, especially in those first 3 years. So play can help strengthen those connections and can even make new ones. So this helps kids, again, understand how things work, how the world works around them, cause and effect, that's a big one. Another reason it's important is for physical development. So play can help in reaching those developmental milestones that you might hear about for our fine and gross motor skills. So fine motor skills are things that use your small muscles. So things like cutting a piece of paper, stringing beads on a piece of string, writing, coloring, picking up toys. So any kind of play that kids do that can use those activities, they're really working on their fine motor skills. Also our gross motor skills, which are our big muscles. So those are activities like, running, jumping, throwing a ball, playing tag. So anything that kids are playing is really helping in their physical development for their little muscles and their big muscles. And the last one is that it helps to strengthen relationships with adults and peers. So having a parent participate in play helps that social relationship. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that later. With peers, learn about sharing, how to take turns, engage in different activities, cooperation, all help in social development and with peer support as well.
That's really great. It's cool to think about play in these different types of ways. When you look at a child playing, you don't necessarily think about everything that's going on, like you just explained, and why therefore it is that important. So you touched on it a little bit, but would you mind delving into some more specifically, like how kids play, different ways that they play?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways that kids can play. So as far as kind of a social aspect, you might see kids playing by themselves without any other children. And so we call that solitary play. So they're just by themselves, not really interacting with other people. Parallel play, so kids are playing side by side, maybe with the same toy, but they're not actually interacting with each other. Associative play, so they're playing as a group, but there are no rules and no organization. So it's pretty common, especially the preschool years. Cooperative play, so they are playing as a group, and that's a little bit more organized, so they actually have rules and a leader. You see that in older children. And then onlooker play is when a child is just watching other people. They're not really interacting at all. As far as types of play, so we talked a little bit about physical play. So those are things that are using those gross motor skills. So things like jumping rope, playing tag, playing hide and seek, all those things that kind of gets kids up and active and running, jumping, things like that. Expressive play, so these are things that kids use materials to kind of express their feelings. So things like, using crayons or markers, colored pencils, watercolors, if they're, cutting things out of paper, maybe using clay. So kind of using almost like those fine art materials to kind of express what they're feeling. Manipulative is really being kind of tactile, using your hands, kind of tinkering with things, using gadgets, maybe taking things apart, putting them back together, which is really critical for kind of using that cause and effect, but also just learning how things work in general. Playing games, so board games, things like Duck, Duck, Goose, anything that use turn taking and have rules. Those are really important for kids to learn, and as they get older, they do kind of incorporate that more into their play. And then a big one is dramatic or pretend play. So this happens a lot with preschoolers. So they're using their imagination a lot. So they might act out different situations that they may have seen, maybe some familiar interactions, like going to the grocery store, going to the bank, taking care of a brother or sister, playing with a doll. So they might act out things they see at home. They might also act out fears that they have to kind of help them kind of maybe get over those, or just kind of to let people know that that is a fear that they're having. So that dramatic pretend play is a big one.
That's so interesting. The dramatic play, especially. My nephew, who's 8 now, when he was a lot younger, wanted to, every time we were in a car, we would take turns. So he wanted to tell you a scary story, and then he wanted you to tell him a scary story. And you would go back and forth. Every time you were in the car, it wasn't even Halloween. He just wanted to tell you a scary story, and he wanted you to tell him one back. And as the adult at the time, you're just like, I don't want to tell another story. But it's clear to me now that he was getting something from that interaction more than just telling a scary story. It was actually beneficial to him as play. So it's really interesting to look back on those sorts of things and think that hey, that was helping him develop. Yeah. All right. So when we talk about play and maybe age range, right? Play can look a lot different. So what does that look like? How does play look maybe throughout the ages of a child?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about early childhood, which goes through birth through age 8. And like you said, there's a lot of variance in how play looks in different age groups. So I have a 1-year-old. She just turned 1. So I have a lot of experience with that infant age group. So with infants, they are really learning about the world around them. And they do a lot of playing with their senses. So a lot of times babies, or small children put things in their mouth all the time. And so they're using that sense of taste, just kind of maybe even texture in their mouth to kind of just learn about the things around them. They also like to, touch a lot of different things. My daughter likes to touch my hair, touch my face. She's really kind of touching textures to kind of learn what is going on around her. So they really use a lot of their senses to discover the world around them. Playing with hair, fingers. She loved to put her hands in my husband's mouth and nose, just exploring, what is in this mouth? What are these things called teeth? Like just a lot of exploration with different senses. So toddlers, they still use a lot of their senses to figure out the world around them through their play. So they are really into things like a water table or sand table, kind of seeing how processes work, a little bit of cause and effect. If I put water in this part of the table and the thing spins, it's kind of that cause and effect. The water does that. So they like to see how things can be manipulated as well. They're also increasing their motor skills. So they're starting to, climb up stairs and starting to run a little bit more. They, pretty good at walking at this point. And then they also start to begin that dramatic play, which leads us into preschoolers. So preschool, that's about, 3 to 4 years old. So that is where that dramatic pretend play, dress up is really big. So again, they're acting out scenes that they might have experience with or other things. And that's huge. If you ever go into a preschool classroom, there's always a lot of dramatic play things set up in a classroom. They're also getting really good at their gross motor skills. So really good at, throwing balls, kicking, jumping, running, all those fun things, riding bikes. And then we talk about school age. And so that's about, 5 to 8 is when we kind of stop talking about early childhood. So their play is more creative because they are older and they have kind of that ability to think a little bit more about their play, but it's less spontaneous, again, because they're a little bit older, and so they kind of think through things a little bit more. But their play is also more organized and has rules and has direction. So they're a little bit more organized in their thought process, and so has rules, and a lot of times get mad when other people don't follow the rules, things like that. So you can kind of see, there's a big progression from, that infant when you're just, sticking things in your mouth to learn about the world, all the way to, being 8 years old and, making an organized game and having rules and working together.
It's pretty cool hearing you talk about the different age groups like this. Because I have a brand new nephew, so he's in the infant stages and just trying to figure out, moving his hands around a lot and things like that. But I also have another niece and nephew, and they're ranging from like 4 to 8. So I really have seen all of these different stages just all at one time, because we're all, whenever the family gets together, it's really cool to see all of that. And my husband's great with them. He is just like a big kid, loves to play with them, everything. I have a little bit harder time connecting, especially at the different age levels, to understand, kind of the best way to interact or keep them excited, whereas he's wonderful. It doesn't matter how old they are, the kids always love him. And I wonder if other, parents or aunts and uncles, could relate to that. So would you mind touching on what you can do as an adult to help play be more meaningful for your child?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I tell people, if a child asks you to play, you should say yes. That's going to make such a difference to them if you say yes, especially if you usually say no. If you say yes, it's going to make their day. So say yes if they ask you to play. So playing with a child, it might actually feel kind of weird, and you might not know what to do, which happens a lot. But I always encourage people to be an active participant. So actually going outside, actually, sitting down and playing with that child and following their lead. So many times when we watch a child play, we're an observer. So if they ask us to play, you're like, oh yeah, I'll watch you. And you might be sitting on the couch and watching them play, off in the corner. But I really like people to be active participant, sitting on the ground with them, having that interaction. That's going to be huge. So it's so meaningful for them to actually get down and play and to follow their lead. So play, I think you said in the definition, is child directed. So a lot of times, you just kind of let them go and try to follow their lead, which sometimes might be a little bit difficult, especially on the age group. A lot of times preschoolers like to change activities, maybe 5 times in 10 minutes. And so you just kind of have to roll with it. And you might not know what's going on. So if they want you to pretend with them and, they're just kind of, off in their own little world, but they still want you to play with them, you might not know what's going on, and that's okay. Ask some questions. Just kind of roll with it, because it's really just going to just kind of make their day that you're actually there. And I talked about before that one of the advantages of play is to strengthen that relationship with an adult. And so actually saying yes and playing them is going to be the #1 key to strengthening that relationship. So a lot of times it's really not about the toy you're playing with or the activity, but the dialogue and interaction that you're having with the child. So, you can help them learn problem-solving skills, making them think, making them take different perspectives, which is really difficult, but a really important skill to learn. So my husband, the speech-language pathologist, told me that the best toys don't talk. And a lot of times we use a lot of electronic toys that do a lot of talking. So the best toys don't talk, but they make the child talk. So things that, don't necessarily make a lot of noise, but the child uses their imagination and has to kind of make up or make believe, do that pretend play, that figure or whatever it might be is actually like the child is giving it a voice. So that helps them with their literacy and their language skills as well. I think of a lot of times, you get a child a big fancy toy for their birthday or Christmas, and it comes in a giant cardboard box. And most of the time the kids are more interested in playing the box than with the actual toy. And that's because it gets them to use their imagination. They can make that box whatever they want to be. So, they don't necessarily need anything fancy and electronic. Just give them a piece of paper or cardboard and just let them have at it. So I talked a little bit about language and literacy. So to encourage that, it's going to feel really weird, but actually putting names to actions is really helpful for kids, especially in those young years. So if a child is, playing with blocks, and I think probably around, 1-2 years old, and say, oh, you have the green block. Oh, and in that hand you have the red block. So you're kind of narrating what they're doing, which is really going to feel very, very awkward. But hearing you say those words helps them in their literacy as well. And also that interaction between you and that child. Also, I kind of talked about this as well, but if you have 2 like figures or characters, making them have a conversation with each other. So instead of, having something electronic, having 2 figures and just having kind of a pretend conversation between the 2 of them. And ask questions. If a child is playing with something, get them thinking. Asking, what if you change this? What might happen? Or what is your pretend friend having for dinner? I don't know. Just making up questions. Just getting them to think and use their language skills is huge for their development. And kind of the last thing I wanted to touch on, to make play meaningful, there is no wrong or right way. So there is no wrong or right way to play as long as you're playing. No one is perfect at playing. I encourage people to get messy, which is adults. A lot of times we don't really like to get messy, or we don't like our kids to get messy. But a lot of times messy play is very meaningful. Be unexpected and be silly. because your kids will be taken off guard, and they will always have that memory of, remember when, our parent did this, or, grandma came and, she put spaghetti all over her face. I don't know. Just, be unexpected and be silly, and repeat. So opposed to a lot of other things with play, it's not so much the quality, even though we do want quality play, but it's a lot more about the quantity. So the actual time spent. Time spent doing no matter what can really have that positive impact on the child.
It's so interesting. This topic is really intriguing to me just because I think about play as an adult, and I have a friend that actually said something to me recently that made me think, and I think ties back into this, but because of the pandemic, her and some people that she lived with were just looking for ways to entertain themselves. And so they started playing a game where they drew circles on a wall, and then they took pine cones and they gave point value to the circles. And so they were throwing the pine cones at the wall. It was just a very silly game. But she said that everybody just played like kids, they just allowed themselves to have fun and be silly. And it definitely kind of made me think that it's a little bit counterintuitive to us as adults to really give into that aspect of just playing and being silly, even when it's driven by a kid. I mean, you said something about letting the child guide the play, even if it's one thing to the next, 5 different things in 5 minutes, which is definitely common. And so I think a lot of times when that was happening with my nephew, I'm more focused on the mess that he's leaving behind versus oh, this is really valuable to him, let's go on to the next thing. Instead, I'm thinking, let's pick that up before we move on. So it's really kind of rewiring how we think of play in our lives and just how it's so beneficial to them and probably to us too, right? Why do we as adults kind of get away from that? Interesting. All right. So any last stories, little anecdotes, anything else you want our viewers to take away as they think about playing with their kids?
So I like your comment that you just made. So it is, as adults, we forget how to play. I feel like as we get older, we kind of, we become more structured in our lives and we don't have the opportunity to play. And so I feel like that's really hard then when we do have children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, to kind of figure out how to kind of let ourselves go back into being like that and being a child. Especially if you feel like something that child is doing is, I don't want to say childish. Mm-hmm. To let go and be silly and just kind of roll with it. It is very difficult. And there are some resources and some books that can help you in kind of getting back into that mindset of playing. There's some great resources online about the importance of play, like I talked about. But yeah, just really trying to get into that mindset of it's okay to be silly, it's okay to play, and it's really going to make a great impact on that child. And let that child play. Children need a lot of unstructured time just to do whatever. And I guess another point as well is that play outside is very critical. A lot of times there's actually a term, deficit disorder, about really the children don't have the time to go outside and play. Nature deficit disorder.
Here we go.
And so, being outside is critical, climbing trees, interacting with textures. When I take my daughter outside, she loves to feel the leaves on the trees. Playing in the grass, it's another texture thing as well. And then, also playing outside on swing sets and things like that. Again, some more gross motor things, kids learning how to swing in a swing. So really, we just need a lot of time to be able to get outside and enjoy nature and play as well.
I hope a lot of people are doing that more, with the pandemic, forcing people at home, right? So, and that's been one of the biggest ways for even adults just to find that kind of break, that piece to get outside. So I love that you said that, really taking the time to get outside, slow down, have that kind of silly play. Something I've definitely noticed with my older nieces and nephews and kind of their age group in general, is that they also seem kind of overscheduled, and that can be kind of taxing. I've heard that's kind of a common problem. Do you have any thoughts about that versus just kind of, the regular play downtime? And I'm really glad that you talked about all of this, because hopefully that'll help people understand maybe the difference a little bit too. Being involved in a lot of activity sounds really great, but do you think that can sometimes stress the child out a little bit sometimes?
I definitely feel like that, yeah. And if it's activities that the children really enjoy, then there's probably not a lot of concern. But I do feel like, having that overschedule and a lot of structured, because a lot of those activities are probably very structured, if they're going to dance class or band practice, things like that, very, very structured. So I also feel like it's important to have just free time just to do whatever they want to do as well.
Sure, finding that balance, I'm sure that's very important.
I'm curious, we're talking a lot about, play, the different ages, and we've talked about going outside and, dramatic play and all of these things, but we haven't specifically mentioned play as it relates to maybe devices or using screens. And I know that with my nephew specifically, he really likes to play games on his tablet. And they do seem beneficial to him. A lot of them are like gamified, like language learning. So he's learning letters and he's learning animals and he's doing all of these things. But I'm curious if there's more benefit to be had from maybe that outside play, or whether there's space in play for those, activities or games on devices, whatever that looks like.
Definitely feel like it could be a balance. I feel like there is some value to that, but the screen time is also a big issue. It's recommended, children have, very limited screen time, especially in the very early years. But I feel like some of those games, especially if they're educational, can help with things like literacy as well, I think you said. But I feel like there needs to be a balance.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the more time they spend on the tablet or on the game or whatever, the less time that they're going to have to do all of those other kinds of play. I feel like with kids especially, it can be very like tunnel vision. Like, I want to do this one specific thing. I'm missing out on all those other great opportunities. Well, I think this is a really great topic. And like Amy said, the timing for this is kind of perfect. We all find ourselves probably around our families, our little ones, a lot more than we have been. So, great opportunity to maybe rethink the way that we approach playing with our kids and how they're experiencing the world around them. So great topic. Thank you so much for joining us today, Katie. And so everybody who joined us, we appreciate you taking the time, and we will see you next month. Take care.